Second part. Unlucky was the only way to describe a person who had twice known fear that reached down to the very pit of their heart. Annette was unquestionably one such person. As the girl was waiting for Pick and the Countess, a gigantic shadow had filled her field of view in a single heartbeat. And the next thing she knew, she was back on that same operating table, and the Grand Duke was looking down at her, just as before. However, this time she had neither Countess Genevieve nor the left hand to aid her. "What are you doing?" Annette asked, surprising herself with how calmly the query came out. She must have had nerves of steel. "Experiments," the Grand Duke replied. Oddly enough, as he looked down at Annette, his eyes were home to a boundless grief. "I heard about that from Miss Genevieve. She said you performed certain operations here, trying to make a bridge between mankind and the nobility. But she said they were fearful experiments." "Indeed. How long did this go on?" "Roughly 5,000 years. Would you like to hear how many procedures I performed in that time?" "No." "Were you successful?" "No." The Grand Duke responded in a bitter tone. For no reason in particular, Annette felt a sorely missed emotion sweep through her heart. It was compassion. "As far as I know, there was but a single success, and it wasn't one of ours." "Were your experiments really all that important?" she asked. "I believed so." Annette saw the scalpel that gleamed in the Grand Duke's right hand. Sweat poured from every inch of her. Though she thought herself composed, her body trembled faintly, and it seemed unlikely to stop. And the Great One said so too. There may well be nobles who would doubt that. I readily pledged my support, although I never dreamt it would stretch over so many long, cruel years. I'm fine with that. Someday the Great One's ideal will be realized. The humans subjected to these experiments were glorious stepping stones, I thought. Annette let out a scream. His scalpel had flashed into action. Flesh split open and bright blood gushed from a wound that seemed to smile. After 5,000 years of this, however, I realized that every time I performed an operation, I injured myself, the Grand Duke said, taking the scalpel away from his coarse, battered throat. I immediately knew the cause. When it dawned on me that I empathized with the humans, I considered destroying myself. It was Genevieve who stopped me. She told me that if I were to die then, no one would be saved. And so we began again, believing in tomorrow, even if it was a tomorrow that might never come. You poor man, Annette murmured, shocking herself. She actually meant those words. Your experiments ultimately failed, didn't they? Correct, the Grand Duke said, tightening his fist in his grip on the scalpel, but he quickly shook his head in denial. Though we failed, next time will be different. Someday our experiments and the hopes of the dead will bear fruit. Toward that end, young lady, I have need of you. Don't. The Grand Duke was changing right before Annette's eyes. All the color drained from him, and as his eyes filled with an evil gleam, they gave off blood light. Forgive me, Annette. I apologize to you and to your family, and I swear that once our aim is accomplished, I will compensate all of you for the fear and grief you suffered by offering up myself to the very next dawn. Forgive me. Please make me stop, Genevieve. In a hand plagued by the past, the scalpel rose. Its blade no longer gleamed on account of the blood that clung to it, and the Grand Duke cried out, "Do not interfere, Pomerolo." Drago spun around and his scalpel flew, not only piercing the figure who just stepped into the room, right between the eyes, but exploding through the back of his head to embed itself in the wall behind him. The man extended his right hand toward the Grand Duke and muttered something. With his first step, the wound to the back of his head closed, and by the second, it was gone completely. Do you resent me, Pomerolo? There was but one step to go. In your case, we were just one step shy, but being short that one step, it was failure all the same. Curse me, hate me if it pleases you, but do not interfere. But I must interfere, declared a youthful voice that hadn't been heard before, echoing through the nightmarish room. Even before the Grand Duke could turn his eyes to the entrance, the second intruder was primping his copper hair. I shall be taking the girl. Grand Duke, feel free to continue this nonsensical contrition for your foolish experiments in the past, for as long as you like. And just who are you? Asked the gigantic noble. My apologies, Xenogilian is the name. I've returned to this world for the first time in ages. The Xeno clan I am familiar with, as I am with the name of the Grand Duke's poor excuse for an heir. What business have you with the girl? A small matter, but one for which there can be no substitute. Might I trouble you to hand her over? Your request is denied. You would do well to remember your station, Stripling. If you were an actual noble, I would. However, I owe no niceties to a spectre from the past. I am taking the girl. You may remain in the company of this other creature of antiquity. As Julian said that, his right arm swept in the direction of the failure, who stood there as if rooted. The dagger flew through the air with searing speed, and the power of a noble knocked the naked man back a good 15 feet. Undoubtedly Julian had taken very clear aim. When the man went flying, the Grand Duke was directly in his path. The two of them collided with the operating table. As the Grand Duke prepared to rise again, a pair of hands clamped down on his shoulders, those of Pomerolo. Lifting the gigantic 700-pound figure as if he were nothing, Pomerolo hurled the noble. Julian was directly in the line of fire. Julian was just about to step to the side when something as thick as a tree trunk caught him in the throat. The Grand Duke's arm. The younger nobleman was knocked all the way back to the door, where he slammed into the wall before stopping. Once he swiftly got into his feet again, Julian saw the Grand Duke draw the sword he wore on his hip. The enchanted sword, Blue Blood, and the wrath of the dead trapped in its blade, would drain the blood and the life from any it touched. The giant had drawn and struck in a single motion, and Julian's blade parried the blow. But the young nobleman's eyes went wide. He could sense something within his body being taken from him. Reeling, Julian leaned against a nearby control console for support. Both his hands and face were red. Blood gushed from his pores. Was it regretted having recklessly challenged a legendary greater noble to battle that flickered across his face? No. As beads of blood covered his face, Julian grinned. Quick, he called over to his servant. You know what to do, I take it. And that being said, he adjusted his grip on his longsword. A second blow from blue blood rained down against it. The instant Julian parried it, a bloody mist engulfed both men. "You bastard. How in hell's name did you manage that?" groaned the Grand Duke. For it felt all of his own blood being drawn out as well, strange as that seemed. Whenever an opponent touches me, not only directly but even with something they hold, their special abilities flow into me. Grand Duke, you're going to be slain by your own power. Julian's eyebrow arched as if he'd suddenly thought of something. That was followed by his lips turning up in a grin and his fangs showing themselves. He heard his idea saying, "I shall inherit this train of yours and its experiments. Only the experiments will take on a new form." The giant howled. Blue blood flashed out, and every time Julian parried it, the two of them were clouded in vermilion. After a number of these blocked blows, Julian was nearly tripping over his own feet. When fighting under identical conditions, the one with the greater strength would prevail in the end, and the Grand Duke was Julian's superior in both energy and brute strength. Parrying a horizontal slash, Julian could take no more and backed away, calling out, "Quake!" The man had been wading off to one side, and that gigantic meatball body of his became a blur. The weights he wore from the waist up shook wildly, and the floor rippled and the ceiling twisted, and the ultra-powerful shockwaves Quake Resting gave off could take the flesh off a human's bones. The Grand Duke's gigantic form was thrown horribly off balance. As Drago spread his arms to either side and planted his feet, Julian charged straight at his chest. His blade pierced the left side of the Grand Duke's chest, poking all the way out of his back. "Genevieve," the giant murmured softly, planting his beloved sword in the floor and leaning on it. "Now I will finally be released." And then he became a huge mound of ash. "That settles that," Julian said, and as he regained his balance on the still quaking floor, waves of excitement swept through his body. He pictured himself glowering out from the train as it sped through the world of darkness. He would travel the world on this train. From every land he'd take lovely young women and drink them dry. But first, Julian began, finally with a chance to recall his initial goal. He turned his eyes to the fallen operating table. "What?" he gasped. Aside from the surgical implements scattered around the table, there was nothing to be seen on the floor. No, that wasn't true. There was one person. Pomerola was in the process of heading straight for Julian. A failure who lived only for slaughter. Was that the shape of the future for humanity and nobility alike? Julian's sword rose. Just then the door opened. As they turned to look in that direction, both Julian and the failure froze. The newest intruder was that striking. "So you made it all this way, Dee," Julian said with a smile. "It would seem it's the risen Grand Duke you seek, but I have slain him. Your usefulness thus at its end. Here you shall die, hunter." Dee's ears caught a bass growl. It was Pomerola. The man's expression had changed. His eyes gave off a red glow, and he exposed a pair of hitherto unseen fangs, making clear his murderous intent. But more incredible than anything were the flames of malice that scorched him from head to toe. The unbalanced failure had finally found an opponent worth defeating. "An acquaintance of yours, Dee?" Julian inquired, understandably furrowing his brow. Gazing at Dee, he continued, "No. It would seem not. That being the case, why would he hate you so? Could it be you bear a striking resemblance to a man who did terrible things to him? Pomerolo charged forward. Knocking everything out of his path, he closed to within 15 feet, then swung his arms. The chains in their blocks of stone arced through the air like ropes to assail the hunter from both above and below. And he seemed to glide right between them. Driving the sword through Pomerolo's heart was actually shockingly easy. And once he stepped away, Pomerolo staggered, but he quickly stood up straight and strong again. His throat and chest were both free of any trace of wounds. An outstanding failure, wouldn't you say, Dee? Julian remarked, his eyes gleaming. If this is an example of failure, how incredible would success be, I wonder? I should like to meet one. However, against an opponent who can be run through the heart without dying, your battle will never end. My apologies, Dee, I have decided to aid this creature. And as he said that, the nobleman bounded. 12 feet high and over 20 feet he sailed. But when he swung his blade low, there was no killing lust behind it. Dee didn't try to evade the blow, but rather parried it, and that was precisely what Julian had been after. He would absorb all of Dee's abilities and use them to slay the hunter. Gah! An ear-splitting scream exploded from Julian's mouth. As the nobleman practically pried his blade free, his face was covered with horrible wrinkles. Such power. The energy is... He was actually weeping. Exactly how much? No, that will be enough. It's more than I can handle. Let's settle this, Dee. Quake. The beefy face blurred, and a second shockwave assailed the room. Dee reeled. Now, Julian thought, charging the hunter. But his foot seemed to catch on something. As the noble tumbled forward, the vampire hunter's blade flashed down at the base of his unprotected neck. Dee turned his eyes not to the head that went flying, but to the body that collapsed. His left hand appeared down by the noble's foot, skillfully dashing over to Dee, making a light bound, and sticking to the end of the hunter's left arm. The Grand Duke stuck me good, but I played dead and slipped into his pocket. I got a nut out. There's only one of them left, so hurry up and take care of him. The instant the hoarse voice said that, a powerful shudder ran through the entire car. When Dee turned to look at the source of the tremor, the rotund figure who looked to be made of big flesh bags had chunks of meat falling off, his bones were crumbling, and in the blink of an eye he'd been reduced to a pile of dust. When Quaker Rustin fought Julian, he died once. Perhaps the massive shockwave just now was his way of bidding farewell to the world before setting off on death's journey, with the master who'd granted him a mock life. A klaxon wailed. That ain't good, said the hoarse voice. Seems the reactor's being nailed. Gotta hightail it out of here and fast. What about the kid? Worried about him, are you? Relax. I told him how to get to the exit and sent him on ahead. What the? The last part was a cry of astonishment. How long had Dee known? Countless figures had gathered around Pomerolo and were staring at the hunter and his hand. Their skin was pale, their eyes charged with lunacy, their limbs twisted, and their bellies trailing innards. Test subjects, I take it? The left hand groaned. Did they get out with that last jolt? Or are they just phantoms? Doesn't matter either way, I guess. Just let them be. They've got their own lives to lead. As the living dead, though. Phew. I smell something burning. Hurry up. Page break. The eye-popping shockwave that had hit the desperately fleeing Pick and Annette as they were making their way down a corridor. Still, without a clue as to what had happened, Pick got back to his feet, having only banged his right shoulder on the wall. "Holy shit," he exclaimed, and it was a wonder his heart didn't stop dead. The Countess lay on the floor, and to her left an iron girder about 20 feet long had apparently fallen. The problem was, Annette's upper body was sticking out from under it. "Are you all right?" The pain in his shoulder forgotten, the boy raced over and a pale face smiled up at him. "Can you pull yourself free?" he asked Annette. "No, it's no use. It won't budge an inch, and my legs are pinned. It hurts." The boy grabbed hold of the girder and tugged, but naturally it wouldn't move at all. "Hang in there. I'm gonna go get Dee." "By then it will be too late," said the Countess. "What?" The boy turned to see the noblewoman pinned under iron pipes. From the waist down she'd been completely crushed. It was a wonder she was even still alive. "There, down the corridor. See for yourself." Following her gaze, Pick went pale. Figures beyond numbering were pouring down the passageway. Like a needle, memory pricked at Pick's brain. "Those are—" he stammered. "They're the ones you glimpsed in the basement. It would seem they escaped with the aid of that shock. These are creatures without an iota of thought, and they live solely to destroy. And it was you guys made 'em that way, wasn't it?" The Countess fell silent, but she soon continued. "A fine mess this is. I no longer have my strength. At this rate the girl and I will both be torn to ribbons. What should I do? Damn it all." "Run for it, Pick," Annette shouted. Her voice was a performance in fear. "If you don't, you'll be killed too. Thanks for everything you've done for me. You've done more than enough. Now you have to think about yourself, okay? You've got to be kidding me. You expect me to run off like a pansy after coming all this way? No, man. Hell, nobody human could do that. Please, flee," the Countess said, her words practically an indictment. "Strive as you like, but you will accomplish nothing here. As the young lady said, you'll meet a pointless death. At least let us see you go free." There were approaching footsteps. 1 person, 2, 10, then 20. Pick fell silent. He was weighing a thought he had. His face grew pale from the staggering nature of that notion. "Pick," Annette said, and she saw the boy look up. Such a sad face he wore, but also such a proud one. "Nope," the boy said, giving her a manly smile. "There's only one way out of this." When Dee arrived on the scene, what he saw there were corpses beyond numbering, with Annette lying in a spot a short distance away. "What about the other 2? The hunter asked. "They left," Annette replied, tears glistening in her eyes. "He got me out from under that girder and pulled Genevieve from the wreckage, then took care of all those things. They told me if I stayed here you'd be along, and with that they left." Dee looked down the corridor. The boy had moved a girder to save the girl. There was no way he'd be able to do that. He needed more than human strength, and by her side there was the noble woman. There was something he could do. Only one play. From the depths of the corridor there floated a doleful melody. Was it a serenade they played? 30 feet away there was an emergency exit. Opening the door, the hunter found a familiar face smiling sheepishly. It was Hiki. His wiry frame was wrapped in a thin membrane. He was an unlikely person in an unlikely place. It knocked the breath right out of Annette. "What are you doing?" Dee inquired. "Actually, I've been trailing the train a good while now. I was looking in through one of the windows, and I just happened to catch the most unbelievable scene. I suppose all my colleagues bit the dust, right? All seems pretty pointless now. I'm throwing in the towel on this one. Grab a hold of my hands. This train's in a bad way." "First things first, it's convenient you happen to be here," the hoarse voice said. Grinning, Hiki replied, "Well, when I poked my head in a little while ago, I happened to run into the little guy. That's when he told me to come here. You know, now he's a go," Dee ordered. Several seconds later, the three of them were down on the ground watching the vehicle race away. It could no longer be described as a black shape. Flames and pale sparks shot from it in a number of places, making it look like a colossal beast covered with wounds. "I wonder where they'll go," Annette murmured as if in a daze, but no one answered her. "Just suppose, if the two of them put the fire out, would they live on the train forever?" "Could be," the hoarse voice replied. "You know what they say. Home is where you hang your hat. The kid's got guts. Maybe someday you'll start some new experiments." Now outlined in flames, the train was dwindling on the horizon. Apparently it was headed east. In the sky there was beginning to shine with stark light. "The boy kept his promise," Dee said suddenly. Hiki nodded. "But I didn't ask him for—" Annette began, wiping at her tears. "Not a promise to you. One he made to himself." After a short pause, the hunter continued. "He said he wanted to become a hunter." Dee touched his left hand to the brim of his traveler's hat as if bidding a gentle farewell. A few minutes later, when the morning sun shone sleepily on the spot, the three of them were nowhere to be seen. The end. Vampire Hunter D, Volume 24, Throng of Heretics, written by Hideyuki Kikuchi, illustrations by Yoshitaka Amano, End. When Dee arrived on the scene, what he saw there were corpses beyond numbering, with Annette lying in a spot a short distance away. "What about the other two?" the hunter asked. "They left," Annette replied, tears glistening in her eyes. "He got me out from under that girder and pulled Genevieve from the wreckage, then took care of all those things. They told me if I stayed here you'd be along, and with that they left." Dee looked down the corridor. The boy had moved a girder to save the girl. There was no way he'd be able to do that. He needed more than human strength, and by her side there was the noble woman. There was something he could do. Only one play. From the depths of the corridor there flowed a doleful melody. Was it a serenade they played? 30 feet away there was an emergency exit. Opening the door, the hunter found a familiar face smiling sheepishly. It was Hiki. His wiry frame was wrapped in a thin membrane. He was an unlikely person in an unlikely place. It knocked the breath right out of Annette. "What are you doing?" Dee inquired. "Actually, I've been trailing the train a good while now. I was looking in through one of the windows, and I just happened to catch the most unbelievable scene. I suppose all my colleagues bit the dust, right? All seems pretty pointless now. I'm throwing in the towel on this one. Grab a hold of my hands. This train's in a bad way." "First things first, it's convenient you happen to be here," the hoarse voice said. Grinning, Hiki replied, "Well, when I poked my head in a little while ago, I happened to run into the little guy. That's when he told me to come here. You know, now he's a go. D ordered. Several seconds later, the three of them were down on the ground watching the vehicle race away. It could no longer be described as a black shape. Flames and pale sparks shot from it in a number of places, making it look like a colossal beast covered with wounds. I wonder where they'll go, Annette murmured as if in a daze, but no one answered her. Just suppose, if the two of them put the fire out, would they live on the train forever? Could be, Nora's voice replied. You know what they say. Home is where you hang your hat. The kid's got guts. Maybe someday you'll start some new experiments. Now outlined in flames, the train was dwindling on the horizon. Apparently it was headed east. In the sky there was beginning to shine with stark light. The boy kept his promise, Dee said suddenly. Hiki nodded. But I didn't ask him for... Annette began, wiping at her tears. Not a promise to you, one he made to himself. After a short pause, the hunter continued. He said he wanted to become a hunter. Dee touched his left hand to the brim of his traveler's hat as if bidding a gentle farewell. A few minutes later, when the morning sun shone sleepily on the spot, the three of them were nowhere to be seen. The end. Vampire Hunter D, Volume 24, Throng of Heretics, written by Hideyuki Kikuchi, illustrations by Yoshitaka Amano, end.